Thank you for being with us this evening and attending, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion because it is timely not just because of the Balkans, but it's timely because of everything that is happening these days in the world. When we were thinking about how to tackle this event a long time ago, last year, a long time ago, even 3 months ago is a long time ago now, we decided to actually definitely link to the Balkans and the wars in the Balkans, and memory, truth, and reconciliation in the region, and also expanding this to about our story and addressing Ukraine as well. But the question was, is it an EU agenda? If I'm now to title the event, I would pose a question, is it a US agenda? So given the ongoing negotiation with Russia, and lack of interest from the US side to include transitional justice as part of an agreement, one can pose a question, to what extent this is an agenda anymore in international relations. It's not here me to answer that question, address this question. I have, how to say, people who are better off than me, and who will more eloquently address it, and let me introduce our guest this evening. Let me begin with Andrea Cayley. She's an executive director of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, Washington, D.C. program, with a PhD from Leiden University. She worked for 2 decades as a lawyer with the United Nations and spent 17 years working in the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, is ICTY, and 3 years in Cambodia working on similar issues. Andrea was the director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law and an associate dean for special projects at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She led a US-Russia Foundation grant training Russia's civil society to prosecute human rights violations. Andrea also has been part of the team at the McCain Institute involved in a rule of law program in Ukraine, and since 2022 serves as a coordinator. Is it still
until
around?
January 23rd. We're waiting.
Okay, until January 2025. Served as a coordinator of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine, the official US, UK, and EU response to war crimes in this country. So, you are also an expert on cultural heritage crimes and elected co-chair of the American Society of International Law Transitional Justice. Sitting next to her is, for the second time, guest of the school, Jelena.
Back by popular demand.
Yeah. Welcome back, Jelena. Jelena Subotic is the professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University, a PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. She writes broadly about international relations theory, memory politics, human rights, transitional justice, international ethics, state identity, and the politics of the Western Balkans. Her book, Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembers After Communism, won the 2020 Joseph Rothschild Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies, won several other prizes, let me just mention a couple of them. The 2020 American Political Science Association European Politics and Society Book Prize, and the 2020 Robert Lee Jervis and Paul Schrader Prize for the best book in international history and politics. Book is excellent. I can wholeheartedly recommend. Yeah, I enjoyed each and every page of the book. So this book explains how East European countries, after the collapse of communism, pursued new strategies of Holocaust remembrance, where the memory, symbols, and imagery of the Holocaust became appropriated to represent crimes of communism. So, and the first book, Hijack Justice, dealing with the past in the Balkans, examines something similar from the Balkans perspective, how, in which international norms of transitional justice were appropriated by domestic political elites in the Western Balkans in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars. Okay, you are working on a book now.
It's done, it's in press.
Yeah, congratulations. So you can say a little bit about that. It's long, I survived. So I will turn to you, Andrea, to begin first. Then after your interventions or presentations, I may have some follow-up questions, and then we will turn to the audience. I'm sure that they will have questions too. Please, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vesko. Thank you also, Elizabeth, for helping organize all of this. For this opportunity to speak about transitional justice and its role in achieving peace, as well as furthering democracy in the former Yugoslavia and Ukraine. One thing that people have to remember is that in the time period from the Nuremberg trials of 1945 to 1993, when the International Criminal Tribunal, the ICTY, opened, there were no established international courts delivering international justice or accountability, even though there had been many conflicts in that period in places like Vietnam, Israel, South Africa, Cambodia, Nigeria. I want to discuss today why there are these new judicial methods, as well as other ways to achieve accountability and why accountability matters. The war in Yugoslavia began in the spring of 1991 and raged until the end of 95. Unlike the continual exposure that we're now used to on social media, seeing photographs of destruction in Ukraine, at that time we only had the evening news at 6:30 in the evening and press. So the first slide. This photograph appeared in 1992. It was a picture of Fikret Alić. It was all over newsstands in Europe, in the United States, and it really sent a wave with people, ordinary people in the US and in Europe, shocked at what they were seeing. If you go to the other. It reminded a lot of people of this. Seeing again in Europe what people had said would never happen again. And if you just go back to the, so this is just another example of the length of time that transitional justice will take. This photograph was from August 17th, 1992, at a concentration camp, Ternopolje in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That case and the accountability for that camp did not come until November of 2017 during the Ratko Mladic trial and when he was found guilty. Let me go to ICTY.
Should I go to
There, perfect. So the call came from people in the US and Europe for action. However, just as we're seeing today, nobody wanted to put soldiers on the ground. Nobody wanted boots on the ground. So the push from people demanding justice, demanding some solution with this war in Yugoslavia, was by European nations and the US to respond by establishing a court that would prosecute those liable for committing the same crimes that had been prosecuted in Nuremberg. The UN started by sending a commission headed by Sharif Bassiouni, a legal scholar at DePauw University, to collect and document the crimes occurring in the former Yugoslavia. His report and his extensive collection formed the basis of what would become the ICTY. In 1993, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 827, establishing the ICTY on the territory it had jurisdiction over 4 clusters of crimes committed on the territory of the former Yugoslavia since 1991. Grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, violations of the laws and customs of war, genocide, and crimes against humanity. The maximum sentence that it could impose was life imprisonment. This was the first time that a tribunal was established during an armed conflict to prosecute crimes occurring while the crimes were being committed. Without realizing it, the international community, by creating the ICTY, took the first steps towards transitional justice in the former Yugoslavia. One thing to remember is there was a hope that the ICTY would stop any violence. And I was sitting in my office in 1995 as the biggest massacre and crimes of the war, the Srebrenica massacre, occurred. So it did not achieve that. The ICTY opened its doors in the summer of '94, and at that time it was solely staffed by seconded lawyers, so lawyers on loan from their countries, from the US Department of Justice, almost all the lawyers from DOJ, a number of Australian lawyers, a number of British military lawyers. So the majority of people who set up and drafted the rules and the statutes of the ICTY were all common law lawyers. They were going to be creating a court based predominantly on common law to be prosecuting people in a civil law country. So it caused a very difficult system and a challenging system for any accused. It meant that they had to basically raise the funds. Their governments had to fund private common law lawyers to defend them. In August 1994, the UN appointed Richard Goldstone as the first prosecutor. Goldstone was not unfamiliar with the conflict. He had been close to Nelson Mandela and was the head of the Goldstone Commission in South Africa. He's still working. I've worked with him now, working with him now on the establishment of an anti-corruption court in The Hague. Amazing, amazing man. He came to the ICT with a transitional justice background, and he accepted the role that the international community gave him: establish the facts, punish the perpetrators, and participate in maintaining peace as well as repairing the effects of the crimes. In all these things, the ICTY had successes and failures. As Judge Patricia Wald, one of the early judges at the ICTY, said, the ICTY is performing three functions: adjudicating international crimes, developing international humanitarian law, and memorializing, albeit horrible, events of modern history. When I joined the ICTY at the start of '95, the entire OTP, the entire prosecutor's office, fit in one room. By the time I left at the end of 2010, we occupied a giant building that entire building was occupied by the ICTY. The ICTY was ordered by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute each of the ethnic groups equally. And that was a mandate that came from New York. Even though in 1995, a CIA report had been issued estimating over 90% of the crimes had been committed by the Yugoslav National Army and by the Serbian population, ethnic groups in different areas. When this report was mentioned, it was rebuffed because the order had come from New York to create equal numbers of cases. Another issue that happened at the ICTY is that they divided the investigations and prosecutions into ethnic groups. So you had teams that were put to prosecute Serbs, teams that were put to prosecute Muslims, teams that were put to prosecute Croats. And this created this bizarre world where you had Australians or Americans or British convinced that that the president of Bosnia was to blame for absolutely everything in the war. It created this very focused tunnel vision in the investigations and the prosecutions, and it's something that I hope in future never happens. It should have been based on regions, not on ethnic groups. Tadic's defense, the first case that came to us at the ICTY was the case of a man called Duško Tadić. He had been a concentration camp guard, so very, very low level. He had been stopped as a refugee in Germany. It's something very interesting to note now with the Syrian war, because there's no tribunal or court prosecuting Syria. Syrians are being sent for prosecution to domestic German courts. So there has been a big flip. Once international courts disappear, it becomes essential for nations to start prosecuting. The Duško Tadić case was small, but it was the only case that the ICTY had. It started things off. His defense argument was that the court was illegitimately created through the UN Security Council, and that was based upon separation of powers. He essentially argued that the Security Council was an executive governmental branch and thus did not have the power to create a judicial body, and that an international body could not judge crimes on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. To resolve this argument, the court was forced to determine its own legitimacy. The decision by the appeals chamber in Tadić represents an important development in the field of international humanitarian law. It's what's talked about when anybody talks about establishing international courts post-Nuremberg. It's significant because it addresses the validity of the creation of an international criminal tribunal by the Security Council, the first ever constituted by the global community. And it found that it does have the legal authority, that the ICTY had the legal authority and the jurisdiction to try war crimes. It established the legal basis and jurisdiction, and it also showed the world that the crimes that were happening in the former Yugoslavia were going to be prosecuted. This small, from all appearances, inconsequential case was the start of a revolution in international law. It cemented the legal basis for all future international courts to prosecute and punish war crimes. However, this was the first case that refocused all of the work of the prosecutor's office. It was determined we are not going to be prosecuting low level anymore. All investigations were refocused to indict the most senior people, political, military leaders in different regions of the former Yugoslavia. The ICTY upheld the mandate given it to by the UN, and it opened investigations into President Slobodan Milošević, President Franjo Tuđman, and President Alija Izetbegović. Through those focuses, they were attempting to build that entire chain of command, using the people that they had as witnesses, either internationals who were negotiating or lower level co-conspirators. They were trying to build and prosecute the most senior generals, the most senior politicians, and eventually the most senior leaders of these three regions. One of the essential messages that the ICTY failed to get through the communities of former Yugoslavia, that there was this equity in investigations. This indeed, it definitely impeded the ICTY as any sort of mechanism of transitional justice. In the end, it was equally hated by all groups. In fact, the investigation into Franjo Tuđman, the president of Croatia, for crimes committed by Bosnian Croat soldiers in Bosnia was legally stronger than the one ever opened for Slobodan Milošević. This leads me to another obstacle in achieving transitional justice, and it's politics, especially in a UN-controlled body. We had to have equal prosecutions even when there wasn't equity in crimes, and we could prosecute certain individuals. I worked on these cases, so I will say that the case against Franjo Tuđman conveniently disappeared in a prosecutor's drawer, even though it was established much earlier and much stronger than the Serbian one. From the demand in equity in investigations by the UN to the push for a quick indictment upon Slobodan Milošević as soon as he was arrested, the minute that politics enter the courtroom, justice can be impeded. There was no indictment for Milošević before he came to the ICTY. We quickly, the prosecutor at that time, Louise Arbour, called in everybody, hundreds of lawyers and investigators, to quickly indict this man. They were under pressure from NATO, under UN, because he had been arrested. The chief prosecutor on the Milošević case, a man called Jeffrey Nice, was pooled between two camps with this case. US prosecutors advised him to prosecute only 3 symbolic cases: Vukovar in Croatia, Sarajevo in Bosnia, and Kosovo. European prosecutors and analysts, however, pushed for an indictment that encompassed all the crimes on the territory of the former Yugoslavia, which meant reinvestigating, reopening everything that everybody had looked at in the length of the tribunal. Mr. Nice chose the second option for the prosecution cases, and it began a very long and unwieldy prosecution case that covered already prosecuted cases and new cases committed by the Yugoslav army. This enormous prosecution involved all of the staff of the ICTY. I might even be going on now if he had not died, Milošević had not died. It also caused a very traumatic effect on our victims. People who had come in to testify about a lower level colonel or general or politician were now being brought back again to testify against a senior leader. In many cases, specifically the cases of conflict-related sexual violence, these women and men never ever confronted their actual person who had violated them and committed the crime against them. They were being re-traumatized and re-traumatized to assist in convicting very senior people that they really didn't even know, who they were. The effect of this extends beyond the budget and staffing with the victims. And the Milošević trial, while it would have lasted longer than most cases at the ICTY, was not unusual. The average length of trials in the ICTY was measured in years, not months. And that has to do with the complexity of the cases. They are much, much more complicated than doing a small case that you would see here for murder or burglary or rape, they involve so many different layers of proving command responsibility. However, there was also the bureaucracy of the UN that led to so much criticism from the locals as well as internationals. The ICTY had originally predicted that it would finish all the trials and appeals by 2008. In fact, it issued its last and final appeal decision in May of 2023. While this speaks to the lengths of trial, it also speaks to its successes. As I mentioned, and is noted here, the ICTY indicted 161 people and convicted 92. When we were there in the start of '95, we did not ever believe we were going to get anybody that we indicted would ever show up. In fact, we managed everybody who was indicted and who did not pass away or wasn't convicted in a different court appeared in The Hague. So what were the after effects on the regions of the former Yugoslavia? So there's no doubt that Croatia, now is a successful though not perfect democracy with a functioning judiciary and legislature and now membership in the EU, can be considered a successful example of transitional justice. One thing to remember and keep in mind in this whole thing, that as the war in the former Yugoslavia was starting and US pooled its support from Serbia and pooled its ambassadors from Belgrade, it needed to base itself and support one region, and it based itself in Croatia. So the Croatian embassy became the basis for all the intelligence that was being gathered. Croatia became a partner, a very close partner with the US very, very early on, way earlier than Bosnia. I was reviewing for numerous cases intercepts, which are intelligence when you intercept communications of military or politicians in Washington, D.C., when I was still working for the Yugoslav court. And the identical papers that I would read once the president of Croatia passed away, Franjo Tuđman, those identical papers were in Zagreb. So basically, all of the intelligence that the U.S. had was coming through intercepts that were being controlled and monitored by the Croatian government. Croatia opened its doors willingly originally to the ICTY because it thought it was a victim. As I mentioned earlier, because Croatian military and political support proved control over the Bosnian Croats who were committing numerous crimes in Bosnia, Croatia and Zagreb, the government in Zagreb, began to pull away. They became very suspicious and did not want to cooperate with the the ICTY. The ICTY very early established a chain of command from Zagreb to Mostar, showing that laws that were being written in Zagreb were being put out as the official laws in a new state that the Croats called Herzegovina. The complete control of the Croatian Bosnian Croat forces, HVO, was through a command in Zagreb. This was all something that the Croats had not expected would be looked at. They thought it was going to be simply the case of Dubrovnik, an attack by a Yugoslav officer, a Yugoslav naval officer from Montenegro. So that lens on actions put them very early on in a position where they did not want to participate and collaborate. But as a candidate for NATO and EU, they desperately wanted in. So they had the carrot and stick where neither NATO or the EU would talk to them until they began to very actively participate and hand over everything, including a Croatian hero, a man called Ante Gotovina. That was all due to their desperate need and desire to be part of the EU and NATO. The longer that membership was delayed, the more desperate and amenable to the ICTY Croatia became. The desire to join the EU also forced Croatia to look at other domestic government structures and weed out internal corruption. This led to indictment and conviction of their prime minister at the time, a man called Ivo Sanader. So this was something that had a direct effect on domestic transitional justice. They were able to progress and attack their own country's corruptions and issues because of the pressure being put on by the NATO and the EU. Next slide. Bosnia because of its continued division into the Republic of Muslims and Croats and a separate Serbian entity called Republika Srpska, even now, 30 years past Dayton, cannot be considered in the same context. The ICTY did not assist the development of transitional justice in Bosnia more than is acknowledged or recognized. The majority of the prosecutions of Croats, Bosnian Serbs occurred on the territory of Bosnia, where the worst of the conflict had raged. While I've mentioned that there is a denial by Bosnian Serbs and some Serbs of the crimes, the evidence put forward has created a repository that has set the record straight. One of the rarely discussed successes in establishing transitional justice was an American Bar Association project in Bosnia called the Rules of the Road. They would come, this ABA group would come to The Hague and review our cases and take anything that was too low to prosecute in The Hague back to Bosnia. And they set up numerous judicial systems to review those cases and get those prosecutions prosecuted. And I want you to keep in mind that nobody is doing that with the cases that the International Criminal Court is. So ICC will indict one person for the DRC, for Gambia, for whatever country that they're looking at, but nobody is after that coming back to the country. There's no funding and support to do that, to indict the lower level cases. So the ABA organized the transfer of all these cases to Bosnia and then assisted in 2005 the Office of the High Representative in establishing the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber in the courts of Bosnia-Herzegovina. This hybrid court is more similar to the ECCC in Cambodia. It has both an international element and a domestic one. 1 year after the adoption of this, a separate ad hoc group started to draft a transitional justice strategy for Bosnia, which was finalized but never adopted by the Council of Ministers of the Bosnian government, mainly due to the disagreement of political parties representing the three main ethnic groups of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The transitional justice strategy was supposed to complement the war crime strategy. It aimed at creating a sustainable platform for establishing facts about the past, and by developing a never again mentality, it sought to prevent reoccurrence of the conflict. After the initial years of this process, however, the war crime strategy had to be revised. It was clear that at the existing pace, it was not possible to meet its ambitious goals and deadlines. In April 2017, the Council of Ministers tasked a working group for the purpose of drafting changes and amendments to the strategy. A revised national strategy for war crimes processing was set up in Bosnia. The revised strategy acknowledged the fact that initial deadline had passed already, and it set the completion of all cases in Bosnia for 2023. It did not happen. It was an ambitious plan while naming thousands of perpetrators of war crimes. It has moved slowly in bringing cases and has been weighed down with national biases that created the war. However, I would not consider it a failure. Without this court, all of the indictees considered too low ranking for ICT prosecutions would never have had to answer for their crimes. In the majority of regions where the ICC is, as I mentioned, there is no further prosecutions. It ends with the ICC. Finally, not only because of the continued division of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Republika Srpska area of Bosnia is still extremely divided from the Muslim and Croatian sections. As late as last year, the U.S. Air Force flew F-16s over Bosnia-Herzegovina in a show aimed to deter secessionist activities. So there's still, as amazing as it is that Dayton exists 30 years on, there is still this tug of war within Bosnia. So there are steps moving towards EU integration. In 2024, Bosnia-Herzegovina adopted important reforms that led to the European Council giving a green light for accession negotiations. This, unfortunately, reforms have stalled. One of the things to remember is that when a country goes towards EU accession, the European Union sends in brilliant lawyers from the EU to review every single dot and line in their legislation and in their laws to make sure that they fit with EU law. The person who worked for Croatian EU accession is now my colleague in Ukraine, working on Ukrainian accession. So this is having to happen in Bosnia, where you have two separate legislative systems, and in Serbia as well. So there are many, many long steps that countries have to go through before he has estimated that Ukraine, unless there's a real political push, will take decades. I will now turn to Serbia and to the effects of the ICTY and transitional justice there. Sadly, here too, the ICTY has had little direct impact on Serb leaders and political parties, the rule of law, or civil society. What impact the court has had has been indirect, the product of a network of other actors like the US and the European Union. Without doubt, Serbia has an exceptionally strong civil society, an amazing, brave individual I worked with for decades, Natasha Kandic. The ICTY never would have been possible without the work of Serbian civil society. However, the dominant opinion in Serbia has been to blame the ICTY for being anti-Serb. And I can attest to having spent 15 years there that there has been this complete lack of communications outreach with Serbia to make it become more involved. And there's still people within the Serbian government who deny that Srebrenica even happened. One significant failure that the ICT made was not to begin earlier. For example, in the Srebrenica case, the ICTY never looked to Serbia's involvement in the Srebrenica crimes. They stopped with Ratko Mladic. Even though he was collecting a pension in the Yugoslav army, he was having, throughout the attack on Srebrenica, he was calling a man called Momcilo Perišić, who was the head of the Yugoslav army. Throughout that, they wanted to focus, for whatever reason, only on that. So Serbia never had to reckon with his actual own involvement in a number of crimes. So I was going to try to go quickly through Serbia. It established in 2003 a war crimes chamber, which within its own court system, and it did it with the support of and funding of the United States government. This was 3 years after the ousting of Slobodan Milošević. At that time, new authorities in Belgrade were eager to regain international credibility after the conflicts of the 90s, when Serbia faced sanctions and international isolation. The transition, however, was incomplete and relied on uneasy and unstable political coalitions. Large parts of the security sector, including the police, armed forces, internal security services, were never touched by the reforms. And they enjoyed the support of some of the new political actors. Large sections of Serbian society believe that Serbia had been the victim of external forces who conspired to break up Yugoslavia. The domestic prosecution of war crimes was directly affected by the internal power dynamics in Serbia. Out of all of the trials, resulting in a conviction of about 60% of the defendants, only 27 trials were ever completed in Serbia. After a shift in power and Aleksandar Vučić becoming the current president, who's the current president of Serbia, and also former Minister of Information from Milošević took over, the prosecution of war crimes cases became just a way to tick the box with the European Union. Serbia still walks a very fine line between the EU and NATO. One sentence that I heard last January during the protests in Serbia over and over were people on the street saying, "We are the people who rejected Milošević and sent him to The Hague. We need your support." And again, civil society is strong in Serbia, and there's such a demand for democracy that it's essential that the international community provides it with support. I used to say, I had originally written the US and the international community, and I removed because we are no longer going to be in that business for the next 3 years. So the creation of ICTY led to the creation of the ICC, to many other ad hoc courts, the court in Rwanda, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and the ICC has continued on its work currently in the Ukraine. Prior to the attack in Ukraine, I was working at the McCain Institute, and we were training human rights and civil society in Russia. This is a group called Memorial, Navalny's group, many groups of civil society who were desperate to prosecute human rights violations in Russia that were occurring in Russia in international courts. So we trained them on how do you prosecute under universal jurisdiction, how do you prosecute in the European Court of Human Rights, all of these different things. As soon as the war started, every single one of the people that I was working with had to leave Russia. So without that support that I'm saying that Serbia needs, Russia needs it too. Unless you're able to be on the ground and train and support the people who are in opposition, there cannot, as much money as you throw in terms of civil society, in terms of transitional justice, there won't be any. Up until January of 2023, I've been working with prosecutors in Ukraine, with the Office of Prosecutor General in Kyiv. We've been building with them and reviewing with them all of their potential war crimes cases. There has never been so much accountability as you saw in Ukraine. The ICC is there. The International Court of Justice has a case pending for genocide that Ukraine filed. I won't go into it because there's so many elements to that case. The ICJ has not, the International Court of Justice has not found genocide either in Gaza or in Ukraine. But as much as all of this was going on, there has never before in history been war crimes prosecutions occurring as the crimes are happening. So Ukraine is so advanced right now in that, in getting that transitional justice. Unfortunately, as I've stated, a $25 million USAID grant for transitional justice was stopped, and a USAID grant on the ground was also stopped. So I'm going to end there, but transitional justice is something that has grown, but unless we continue to support those who are in the countries where transitional justice is necessary, even if it's a country like Serbia or Russia, where politically there's no advancement of transitional justice, it just won't happen. It's not possible.
Thank you, Andrea.
Sure.
Thank you. Jelena, please.
So I'm not prepared. I got no slides. I got nothing. I can talk. So I want to say a few things of more general nature and slightly kind of bigger picture. I admire tremendously the work that you have done, and it's a little bit depressing, I think, to see how many years have gone by and how little, if at all, progress has been made. But I'm going to try and kind of talk a little bit about why, from a kind of bigger picture, there's been less progress. And I want to start by saying that I think transitional justice as a concept has been given a lot of assumed power that on its own, transitional justice is going to fix things. And that has not happened, but it's not necessarily the case that it's just in these countries that it's going to not happen. That's just not going to happen, because transitional justice is not a thing that exists outside of a much larger political system, but also a much larger historical memory narrative framework. So all of these mechanisms, the trials and the courts and the testimonies and the decisions and the sentences, all of that gets filtered through the already existing narrative framework through which political establishment, but also regular people interpret the news. So to say a few things more about that. So the first thing that I think we should consider is that there's a big difference between history and memory and narratives about history and then transitional justice projects. These things are very, very different. So history is what happened. Memory is what people remember about what happened, and that is often not the same. In fact, quite often it's not the same. And then there are narratives about what happened, stories that people tell in their families. What was my grandfather doing during World War II? Oh, he was a really good guy, really, but what was he doing? Oh, he was helping. Where was he helping? Well, he was helping prisoners, or, oh, he was a camp guard. Okay, all right. So, but to get to my grandfather was a camp guard, you have to go through layers and layers of very sticky narratives that people have in their families, and then extrapolating up from families into society and then from society to state. So think about, even from your own, everybody has a personal history of something that somebody's grandfather did something bad. Between the two of us here and like this whole room, we can all talk about, various legacies that are sometimes out in the open and sometimes are hidden in people's families. And think about why families want to preserve a certain pristine image of their ancestors. So then think about societies as kind of a big family. There's a vested interest in preserving a pristine image of your nation, that you are always on the good side and you would never do anything bad and you're always a victim and you were never a perpetrator. And that also reflects then well on you. So I'm a member of this group, my group is always good, I am good. These are extremely difficult to break. And think about how somebody in your family would react when you would bring evidence, and this happened to me. I had evidence of what my grandfather did, had to present that to my mom. It's not comfortable, but you have to say everything that you thought is wrong. I have archival evidence of something very different. It's very difficult for people in families and then in societies and then at the level of states to break apart mythology that they have developed about their own goodness. Okay, so I'm putting that, I have a plan. I'm putting that back in the context of transitional justice. So when these decisions and sentences come from some court in The Hague, they come into an already very well-developed system and narrative framework of who we are as a people. And if they're negative, if they talk about something that we have done that's bad, they're rejected. It's much easier to reject it than to then say, oh, wait, let's see, maybe my group did this. Because then it, again, reflects poorly on you. So I think the big problem with transitional justice mechanisms is that the assumption was that if they would just be put there, if we would just know what happened, people would just believe it. And they would be like, oh, well, I guess my group did this. That was a horrible thing. I will now change everything that I was ever told about the way in which my ethnic group functions in the world. And that is just not how any society would react. So the problem, I think, is not necessarily on what the ICTY or any other court did or did not do, is that there was a big disconnect between those legal institutions and then other institutions that exist in society. So somebody had to tell those stories to the people. So those are all the media, those are all the press. So when I was still living in Serbia in the 1990s, when ICTY started its proceedings, for the first couple of days, the proceedings were televised on national TV, so you could kind of watch it. They were so boring and so not interesting because it's technical law. There's not a single prosecution I would ever watch on TV. It's incredibly boring. Yeah. And so it's like now we call a witness, then there's a pause, then somebody translates, then they say there's a break, and then there's like a very specific technical jargony discussion about something that people don't understand. After 3 days, nobody watched it anymore. So this entire idea that this will filter through society, that will filter through media, that we will all be glued to the TV and find the truth, disappeared after 3 days. Now, so put that then in the context of a heavily regulated and repressive political regime that does not allow many things to be on TV, or at least guides what is shown and what is not. And so you have a combination of lack of accessibility and lack of knowledge and interest, so that these decisions and these trials kind of hang out somewhere in space in The Hague, and at the local level, nothing has changed. There's also a political interest of the elites to continue the stories of their own success and continue the stories that they were on the good side of history. I mean, in the context of the war crimes in the Balkans, the leadership of Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serb part of Bosnia, continues to say that they need to secede from Bosnia and form their own country because they're the ones who were victims of violence. And so, as you know, they kind of revert this slogan, never again, to say never again will we Serbs be killed. And then you're watching from the outside, you're like, well, no, actually you were the ones doing the killing. But this is not what is the narrative at the local level. And then the final thing I want to say is that there's also an assumption that you explained it so well in the context of Croatia, that there's an assumption that countries will want to prosecute, they will want to get these bad people out of their own government. I remember when I was doing research for my first book, which was on this exact topic, on the ICTY, I would hear people tell me, in courts, domestic and international, are great because they're going to serve as vacuums. They're going to vacuum, suck out the bad guys out of government. They're still there. One of them is president of Serbia. Out of that vacuum that didn't work. Whoever bought that Dyson, it needs to be returned. It's still there. And so I was like a PhD student. I was like, oh no, that's very optimistic. But there was the assumption that countries will want to move on, that the governments will want to get bad guys out of there, and that's how they will move into, the European, paradise. And in the case of Croatia, that worked better than in any of the other states, but not because I think of, necessarily a better trial system or a better court system. I think it's exactly what you said, is that the Croatian political narrative, again, the thing that you think about yourself, was so pro-European. And the most important thing for Croatia is that not only will we join Europe, we will rejoin Europe. We are already European. We're so European, we're more European than anybody else who's ever been European. They were like, well, hold on, like, have you met Paris? It was like, we're European. And so we'll do whatever it takes. We'll just, send those guys, we'll do that. And that desire to be part of this desired European club, EU, NATO, also at the cultural level, to be culturally European, to be considered, like a tourist attraction. Oh, do I want to spend, my summers in Croatia, or do I want to go to Vienna? That's very important in Croatia. That just does not exist in Serbia. Serbia does not care. Serbia's cultural affinity and a desired cultural club is Russia. And in the latest war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, it's become very obvious. Serbia is the only European country other than Belarus that is full-on ally of Russia, because they see Russia as its desired club. They want Russia. Croatia is like, we don't want that, we want to go to Vienna, we're European. Serbs, as a national group, has developed a narrative of a cultural, Slavic, Orthodox affinity with Russia, but also that they view Russia as the only country that is kind of a bulwark against the horrible West. It's the only one that's anti-Western. They agree on all their conservative policies on, sexual freedom, LGBTQ, all of that. They're like, yeah, Russia gets it. They hate gay people too. They get it. And so, it's really out of step with kind of a broader European kind of liberal cultural attitudes as they developed over time. And so it's not surprising to me that Serbia is now going to do whatever it needs to be done to get into the EU, because getting into the EU is it's not that desirable as it is. And so I think when we think about what we can call a success of transitional justice, I think we should really think about how these processes are interpreted domestically, how these narratives can change, and how maybe they can be tied, like in the Croatian case, with some other thing that they want to do, so that they can kind of eat their vegetables with the candy. And that's not been the case in any other country. So I want to stop because
thank you, Jelena. Thank you. I want to do like a post, at least from my side, as I often say, I'm from the Balkans, therefore I will abuse the power and pose two questions, one for each of you. So let me first paraphrase the Serbian writer Svetoslav Basara, who once said that the future is fixed. We can little do with it, but the past is moldable. And we can do whatever we want with the past. So this is, I think, echo what you have just said. I can't agree more with your points about the ICTY and how not just ICTY, but we can expand this story for and include other courts, fail to provide transitional justice for societies like Balkan societies. So indeed, it is important to bring individuals to the court, to establish, to establish, a trial for those who committed war crimes. But it's turned out that it is not enough. In fact, it turned out that didn't work well. You mentioned either the vacuum didn't work well, then you mentioned also that ICTY was hated by everybody, mostly by Serbs, but Croats as well, Bosniaks as well, Albanians as well, so on and so forth. Then, question for you, Jelena, is what do you think? And then the revival of history revisionism nowadays is another example of that the ICTY didn't work well. What, in your view, what is missing in there? What type of policies should have been applied to make a better result? I know we don't have a magic wand. This is just like a visual thinking.
I'll be quick. So I don't think that this is ICTY's fault. We put too much burden on a legal institution to fix societal problems. That seems crazy. Like, we don't do this in this country. We don't want like the court to fix like the profound problems that exist. The courts do their own thing, especially international criminal justice. This is driven me insane. I've written an article about this in 2011 where I talked about three levels of accountability. So there should be individual criminal accountability. That's the ICTY. But then there should be societal and state. These are completely different levels. ICTY is a court that has a very, very narrow scope. They look at evidence for one person or for one thing that they have done. How can that fix society? So it's important, but it's like a small slice of a much broader social transformation that has to exist at the state level, at the level of political establishment, and blah, 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 and at a societal level. So I think what is missing is a much broader transformation of how history is taught, what people learn, what's on TV, what kind of media stories are reported, investigative journalism. People don't know, or it's hard to find out, or it's easy to deny. And so all of that needs to happen, and that needs to be a domestic process that doesn't need to be brought in from the outside. I don't need somebody to come, people will not respond well to some international commission coming and, pointing to what's wrong in their textbooks. But there needs to be an explained, from politicians and from, cultural workers and education workers, there needs to be an idea, needs to be explained, like, you want to live better. This is how you live better. You live better by facing what was bad so that you can be good in the future. And nobody has ever done that. And that was the vegetables part that nobody wanted to eat. I think it's not the ICTY's fault.
Yeah, I agree with you. This should be complemented with education, with, as you mentioned, policies across different domains in the country to make it done. Case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, when we have two schools under the same roof, teaching two different curriculum and two different histories, perpetuate hatred and actually is conducive for a new war, a new conflict to happen. So this is not the way forward.
One thing I would add is that Germans did not like Nuremberg. They wanted prosecutions against U.S. for their military destruction, for the acts that U.S. did. And what is better, you look at what happened in Yugoslavia. A perfect example is the Sierra Leone court, where the Sierra Leoneans have had justice. Sierra Leone is on a different level. They prosecuted Charles Taylor, a Liberian, for their crimes. Their level of democracy, their progress is so much higher than Liberia, where there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that found people culpable, but those culpable people were allowed to run for political office. So that country is completely in disarray. Our last U.S. ambassador for war crimes helped establish a hybrid court there. I don't know if it's ever going to happen or not, but when there's no accountability,
Yeah, people need to be vaccinated. Like you can, January 6th,
ICTY might not be perfect. Nuremberg maybe wasn't perfect, but no accountability and no transitional justice is impossible without it.
Yeah, then a question from my side, and the final question, maybe more for you, Andrea. You mentioned ICTY, and we also mentioned a couple of other international tribunals at the time, either Cambodia, it is now Sierra Leone, Rwanda. So many, when they look back in the 90s and the early years of the 21st century, portray those years as a golden era of multilateralism. The period when those courts could be established as such, with a clear mandate what to do. Then given what's going on right now, in the crisis of international organizations and international institutions and challenges that international tribunals face, how do you see the future of international tribunals? How do you see the future of, can we imagine the ICTY? Can we imagine any court anywhere, anytime soon, to deal with human rights violations and war crimes?
So one of the things I do with my students that I didn't do here, so you're saved with those slides, is the cost. Is the price tag on each of these courts, which is hundreds of millions of dollars. So after this beautiful era of courts being founded, things started stopping. Nobody wanted to fund these courts. And then you had the political dimension. The first big war after that was Syria. So that was allowed to happen. What has replaced the international courts is a legal concept called universal jurisdiction. So for those who don't know, it's a legal concept that when a crime is so heinous, it can be universally prosecuted. It is not used in the United States because of some of Henry Kissinger's ideas of law and diplomacy. We have passed Torture Act. There's a Torture Act in our laws. We tend to use immigration fraud. We find different tools to use in the US, but in Europe there's a very vigorous universal jurisdiction system happening now. Ukrainian war crimes are being prosecuted in Germany. As I mentioned, Liberia, I've worked on universal jurisdiction cases for Liberia in Switzerland, in France, in Germany, in the United States under US laws. So it's turning back into domestic courts. Now the issue is that you're having Germans, and in the US, in these Liberian cases I worked, we had a Pennsylvania federal prosecution jury judging Liberian crimes. And while it might make this very universality of crimes, the horror when they hear of cannibalism or they hear some of these crimes, there are dimensions here that maybe isn't the most equitable forms of justice when you're putting, and a number of these, there was recently a Finnish trial of Liberian war crimes, and you saw all 8 Finnish white male, blue-eyed, blonde judges walking around Liberia to determine if this Liberian guy was guilty. All that was missing was like the pith helmets. It's a very, as much as you're a supporter, you want accountability for all these crimes, it can take on this colonialism.
Anything to add? Okay, now it's time for them to turn to the audience. Please introduce yourself. Okay, I see first you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys both for your very informative talk. I'm Beeman. I'm a undergraduate at Boston University, and I have a question for both or either of you. So you mentioned the important role of the U.S. in the execution of the ICTY and the domestic courts that they were helping the ICTY with. So considering the current administration's actions in deciding not to support a UN resolution or saying that Ukraine started the war, or even current issues in Ukraine, like Zelensky saying he would step down if the Ukraine could join NATO. What do you think that the ICC can do? And is there a future for the ICC, also considering the fact that the U.S. is becoming so aggressive and isolationist? Is the fact that they're pushing all these ideas and their own almost imperialistic beliefs, does that make the U.S. appear stronger, or does that, the fact that the U.S. is pulling away so much from international institutions make the ICC weaker?
Thank you for the question. I was thinking about that question. And at the very last one, I dropped it out. You know, I didn't want to be so like a difficult interlocutor this evening, but please.
I'll go very quickly, and then
Yeah.
Jelena, if you want to talk about more of the politics. So the ICC, a lot of people don't know, one of the strongest supporters of the ICC's formation was the United States. While we wouldn't fall under its jurisdiction, we were active members of the Rome Statute, in drafting the Rome Statute, and during many of the early years, we were the main, our special forces were doing those arrests in Africa. So the US was a sort of hidden supporter of the ICC. And in the first Trump administration, we began to pull out. It was our first mention of sanctioning people who work there. This recent executive order by Trump is extremely worrying. Anybody who works at the ICC, their families will be sanctioned. They cannot. There was a moment where my colleagues who are working at the ICC were told they didn't even know whether they'd ever in any country be able to hold bank accounts, because all these countries have banking agreements with the US, Netherlands, UK, wherever they're from. So it's basically saying if you work in trying to protect international justice, you'll be finished. Your career is finished, everything. So we are completely doing a 180 from this last administration, where we were slowly rebuilding links with the ICC. There was progress. The Office of Global Criminal Justice was headed by a close friend of mine. She was involved all over the world in establishing, if not hybrid courts, but some sort of forms of accountability. So we're taking a major step away from this. I don't know what the future will be. We're, you know.
I mean, I would just say that other countries are going to organize against the U.S. So they're going to form an anti-U.S. coalition. I mean, that's just. I mean, already the new chancellor of Germany, Merz, gave a talk yesterday. He was like, "Bye." I mean, like, this is. I don't want any piece of this. Yeah. Like, you guys made your decision. I'm out of here. We got. We're going to do our own thing. So I think the cost is the other issue as well, and so how they can organize, but they will do their own European things. There's European Court of Human Rights, there's European Court of Justice, there are all these universal jurisdiction, local domestic, they'll just let the US do its own implosion on its own and just watch and be like, glad we're not there.
Yeah.
Tim Long, and I've done work for ICTR and done trials in Finland and Sweden and the UK and Canada and the US for universal jurisdiction cases. So the ICC was created in part recognizing some of the problems with the ICT1 and the ICTR, the startup costs and the having to create all this. So ICC was supposed to address some of that. We had big dreams for it. And a lot of it's been really pretty disappointing. We found the case in Kenya, that if the people are in office, that you can't really prosecute because they'll end up killing the witnesses. That if you take a case in Uganda where the president asks the ICC to come in, but then puts his arm around the prosecutor, and so it's clear that it's not going to be balanced in some ways. I mean, some of the Congo cases were okay, but it's just so disappointing.
It's
and so I guess the question for me is not so much if we can set aside the Trump chaos. Mm-hmm. God, I would love to set aside the Trump chaos. But just not considering that, what is the role for international justice now? Because the idea was that it can happen where you can't do it domestically, but as you're suggesting, that you need it at all levels, and it really seems only if you're doing things domestically that you're getting the kind of impact that you really need. It was also theoretical before, and now that we've actually had 20 plus 30 years of doing this, we're seeing that all these sorts of problems. So where do we go?
Yeah. So the ICC is not great. Like, it is tragic that we're pulling out and that we're not going to be involved and that we're not supporting some sort of concept, but the ICC has been troubled from day one. It was a European court prosecuting African crimes. Each one of the prosecutors, especially the current one and the first one, there have been very, very serious problems with both of those people. So it's a tragedy of international courts. But at the end of the day, what do you do? Nothing. So moving forward, we have lessons learned. Perhaps it's something that we can say, find different types of prosecutors to head these courts. Don't make it so political, the selection. They did, the investigation into Ukraine was a real breakthrough, going after, Putin, and everybody felt re-energized with that. The Gaza investigation, one of the biggest problems is that they never went on the ground. They were offered, the prosecutors in The Hague were offered by the US and by Israel time to spend on the ground with meetings and stuff. They never did. They just indicted. So that's worrying. I don't know. Again, it's turning to universal jurisdiction because these are courts that people understand. We understand our US court, we understand our German court. And it's cheap.
But bringing
it's cheap.
Rwandan women to Manchester, New Hampshire, it's like so awkward.
It's awkward. They do get, I have to say, the Liberians do feel that they got their day in court because they never got it before. But whether the real justice for the defendant, although some of these, is there, if it's a real system, I'm not sure. But yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Lily. I'm a master's student here at Pardee. For my master's thesis, I'm actually looking at the UN intervention into Bosnia as one of my case studies. So with that said, I guess a question I have, you had shown an earlier example of one of the Time magazine covers of, I believe, the 1992 Serb concentration camps, and then you said that one of the earliest goals of the ICTY was to help kind of stop the violence that was happening, and with that specific goal in mind, it failed. So I guess I was wondering, in your opinion, do you think it failed because perhaps the full scope of measures weren't taken when going into the development of the ICTY? Or because we've talked about prosecution and everything, and it's hard to do prosecution and also have stopping the violence as a goal. Those seem like those are two separate things. So I guess in your opinion, what do you think are some of the reasons it failed in that goal? Is part of it connected to we're doing this in response to media coverage and we're trying to stop this quickly? Or I'd just love to hear your take on that.
So the ICTY was a UN construction. I think it just, look, we have all these accountability measures in Ukraine and it's not doing anything. It doesn't, that threat of ending up in The Hague, or that threat, even then they knew what The Hague was. Ratko Mladic, he had seen people go there, he knew it existed. It wasn't enough of a threat. It didn't carry enough. But in terms of the UN and the ICTY, the best witnesses, the biggest support that we had were actually the UN soldiers on the ground. They were the key people, for some of the cases that we did in central Bosnia, they basically just brought us a package of evidence. Their photographs on the ground, the people that they've spoken to, everything allowed us to quickly indict and prepare. So the partnership on the ground was amazing with the UN, and those were also all different battalions, Dutch Bat, all the different groups that were there. But Mladic did not care about The Hague. Should have. He ended up in The Hague.
Just a second, but we also have evidence of that even in contemporary crimes. Bibi Netanyahu doesn't care. In fact, there's a inverse loop where Bibi Netanyahu wants to stay in power as long as he can so that he doesn't end up in The Hague. And how does he stay in power? By creating more and more wars and more Bibi chaos, so that, if anything, is a reverse logic there. But again, I don't think it's ICTY's job to stop violence. It's a court. Think of it as a court. It's a courthouse. Yeah. Other groups, institutions, in the Bosnian case, the NATO intervention should have come way earlier than after Srebrenica. That picture alone, that's Omarska camp, I think, right? That alone, Trnopolje, you said, Trnopolje, yeah. That alone should have, so there are other ways interventions to stop violence. It's not a court.
Yeah. I see one. Oh, yes. Yeah. No, you.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. My name is Estelle Brown, and I'm a PhD student in political science at BU, and I study institutional memory in Western democracies. And my question is for Professor Subotic. I really like your way of framing this structure between family, society, and state. And I was wondering if you could tell us where you think the EU fits in this you know, like
It's like a
three.
step family. Stepmom. No, go ahead.
So I was wondering, because it has its own commemoration dates, it has its own memory apparatus, and it also commemorates atrocities in Bosnia. So are we supposed to understand the EU as something that just functions like a state, or is it something different, something new, better?
Yeah, well, the EU's had a bad moment too. You know, like remember, like Hungary is part of the EU, so we have an authoritarian, personalistic regime that is like all they do is do revisionist history. Like Viktor Orban gets up in the morning and lies just about everything, about history of Hungary, about history of World War II. And there's no mechanism to kick anybody out of the EU. A very bad flaw in the design of a club is if you don't have an exit mechanism. Like like my tennis club has I have to sign rules, and if I do something bad, I'm going to kick out. EU doesn't have that, and so they have to deal with these terrible regimes. Poland kind of got itself together recently, which was amazing. So there's hope for all of us. Looking at I thought I'd say this in my life. Look at Warsaw for help. But I'm not sure what we're going to do with Hungary. So anyway, so it's not as if the EU is it doesn't speak with one voice. It's also, I think, become very clear that the EU really is a fragmentation of states. That the power of the nation states is way stronger, I think we're seeing now, than we all assumed in the kind of glory days of EU and this fast move to EU accession in 2004 when all these countries were getting in and and there was this assumption, again, that everybody's going to want to join. I don't think it's either maintained that idea of being super desirable club. It has not brought that much. It's certainly better to be in the EU than not to be in the EU. But in Croatia, for example, there's a lot of disappointment with economic level. People, the expectations, again, it's always this, once we get into the EU, we're going to live like the Germans. Well, no, you're going to live like you're in Croatia. You just, everything's now much more expensive because you're converted into the euro. And so the expectations were so high, I don't think they were met. Then I think a big problem of legitimacy of the EU was what happened with the Greek debt crisis and how Germany reacted to that. So clearly, people started to think, there's like first-class EU and then third-class EU. And I think EU is an international institution, but I don't think by any means it's a supra-state. It doesn't function as a supra-state. It functions as a kind of, economic federation of some kind with huge inequalities within it. And so it has its own memory politics, but that memory politics serves to further promote the legitimacy of the EU itself. It's like to celebrate itself and how awesome we are. And even within the EU, different states would have very different understanding of even the very recent past. Hungary, for example, and Poland, they have a very different way of understanding what happened, even as recently as 5 years ago, and certainly as it relates to Ukraine.
I see one more over there. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you. My name is Mackenzie Hackett. I'm a senior studying international relations as well as classical archaeology.
I like that. Wait, hold on, stop. Because my new book is archaeology. So what about classical archaeology? What part are you interested in? What do you?
Well, more so like the intersection of international laws, like human rights, so cultural heritage, but protection.
Yes, I'm so excited. Yes, that's my new project. I love this. Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. My question pertains to both of you. The first was you kind of talked about the 180 and not really necessarily knowing where you're going to turn next. But I know there were varying levels of discussion regarding efficacy of international courts and transitional justice. So I think my question is, how do you shape change? Like, what's the best mechanism? You talk about narratives and memory and how that is an obstacle to people supporting transitional justice. And obviously we're facing a lot of challenging things in today's society. So if either of you maybe have like suggestions or how we could possibly speak to the public or better connect to the public, regardless of like what state, but I'd say overall, how we can improve, I'd say, education and how people might become more interested in transitional justice?
Well, I mean, in the cases of the former Yugoslavia, and I assume that's a broader issue, people are interested in transitional justice when it's the other guys accused of killing their guys. Then they'll watch the stuff on TV. yes, I told you that, the Albanians killed us all. But then you're like, well, no, actually, if like in half an hour they're going to be, talking about how Serbs killed them. Well, not like that. And so it's very difficult again to turn into a broader understanding that crimes are crimes no matter who committed them, because people personalize it. And people will say, well, no, we're not like that. I'm not like that. So it's impossible that my people did that. But I also know, because my people are good, all these horrible things have happened to my people. So it's not that they're not interested in transitional justice. They're not interested in their own accountability. So it's a very different thing. Transitional justice, they'll watch it. But the issue of accountability, especially your own, did I vote for this person? Did I support this? Did my taxpayers' dollars go into setting up the Ternopolje camp where this guy was starved? Then you have to think about like what you did, and it's a huge lift. And again, believe me, we live in the United States. Like this is what we're facing this in our current moment. So I think the only way is really to present. It's almost like you have to kind of lift people's broader sense of morality. Like, who do you want to be as a person? Like, how do you want to present this to your children? Do you want to present yourself as somebody who is able to face accountability? Again, I'm going to go back to the family. You teach children that it's okay to apologize. You actually tell them apology is good because people will like you better if you say you're sorry. And so like you have to kind of teach that level at the level of society. And Germany to some extent did that, which is kind of the best of all the horrible cases. They did the best, but it's not perfect. And Canadians, can apologize for everything, even stuff they don't have to. But they'll, Canadians apologize a lot. Australians have done some apologies to the Aboriginal crimes. So this happens, but I think it has to be presented as a social value that we as society, we want to value justice. We want to value, absence of violence. We want to value solving problems without conflict, and that it starts at the individual level. It's very, very hard. It's very hard.
Do you want to pose a question? I have a question, but if you
Well,
Thomas.
Thomas Berger, I'll be joining you later on. I just want to ask, put in a kind of slightly cynical way, a positive notion about the future of criminal justice, international criminal justice. And it seems to me that often the purpose of courts is to manufacture a sense of justice. And the question is to manufacture a sense of justice for who? And it often seems to me that many of our efforts in the post-Cold War were to try to manufacture a sense of justice for Western foreign policy. So when we intervened in Bosnia, intervened in Kosovo, failed to intervene in Rwanda, our purpose was trying to create a sense of courts which would help justify our goals. And the Germans, for example, and the Europeans, signing on to these out-of-area missions, they have to do it not simply for national interests, preserve NATO, expand NATO, find a new mission for NATO, but to make it a part of a larger project, to spread democracy, to create the kind of system that we had in Europe, in now Bosnia, perhaps in other parts of the world. That sense will not disappear. That need for legitimacy will not disappear. And therefore, while it might not have the purposes that we've hoped, it'll continue to have the hidden purpose it's always had. Just want to react.
Yeah, one of my concerns with that, it definitely was a part of everything, but the point and the goal of the ICTY was to do the individual accountability. Serbia is not to blame. Milosevic, Mladic, we have our individuals. So it was hopefully to get rid of that politicization, that of course it was political in many things, but one of my concerns is that one area that Russia is really pushing on peace negotiations right now is removing accountability. They don't want any accountability for any of the crimes. So I've been working since the start, since they invaded. For the archaeologists back there, one of our cases is Russia has organized from the Hermitage Museum. They're going into Crimea, they're digging, their top archaeologists are taking that back and displaying it not just at the Hermitage as reclaimed Russian heritage, but at UNESCO in Paris. They allowed Russia to do an exhibition on reclaimed heritage. So
they're stealing stuff from museums. They're going in and just taking stuff in bags.
As part of accountability, if you remove as part of a peace plan, if you remove 100% accountability for Russia, it's darker than anything that happened before. Because, to have that, there will never be accountability for the Ukrainians there if they can't even prosecute in their own courts what happened to them.
Before posing a final question from my side, let me just comment on what we have discussed so far from a very more individual perspective, but that perspective can be applied to any society. Carl Jung, a famous psychiatrist, introduced the concept of shadow. It is a shadow. Shadow is a place, or they can call it a den, or where we put all the things, all those cringe that we got embarrassed when we did something wrong, when we said something wrong, when we didn't do things properly, or we didn't say what we were supposed to say at that very moment, and so on and so forth. According to him, this is good because this helps us remain sane. But what we need to do is, from time to time, to open that corner of our basement or the shed, whatever, and look at this shadow. We need to put some light into it in order to remain healthy. So for that, we need a considerable moral strength. It is what every society needs to do, to look at its shadow and look at it eye to eye. And this considerable, moral strength is needed and is missing in many societies, including the societies that we were speaking about, but including even this one. History teaching is a very, very challenging issue. This is my comment from my side, but final question, if you can, they're different, but very similar to what we have discussed so far, and maybe more for Jelena. Can you just tell us a little bit about the ongoing protest in Serbia, and why the West is ignorant to that? Are they taking place in the wrong time, in the wrong moment? Something which is going against the mainstream currently in the West.
Well, I think nobody cares about Serbia. That's why it's not in the news. It's it's not a major. If we were protesting Iran, I think we would hear about it. It's a small country that is of no real importance, I think, for the Western press. So that's that. But the protests, just to recap, have been going on for months now. They're right now student protests. They're often protests. I mean, this is not the first time. There's like cycle of protests, and you mentioned, the strength of civil society. So the current wave of protests are student-led. There was an accident at a train station in Novi Sad, which is the second biggest city, where the roof collapsed from like shoddy design and corruption, and some horrible company was paid off. It was, corrupt company, blah, blah, blah. And a number of people were killed. And the prosecution decided that there's no crime here, nobody's going to be considered, accountable. And so that really, that's not why the students are protesting. The students are using that as a motive to protest against state capture and deep corruption in Serbian society, complete lack of accountability, semi-authoritarian government, and everything else, repression of the media, repression of other civil society. So the students also, and the reason why the protests have been going on for so long is that students are, young, they can go outside, and they have stamina. No, seriously, they can go out, and withstand pretty cold temperatures. But also, they have more legitimacy as a social and political actor in society than anybody else. So even people who are more on the kind of in the middle, they're kids, they're students, so they're not corrupt yet. It's not a political party. I don't have to say who I'm going to vote for. I'm not, supporting some opposition party that I don't quite agree with. It's students, or they like students. So they've been managing to maintain the protests by not affiliating themselves with any political party or any political leader, which also is why I'm not sure it's going to lead to anything, because there's no clear transformation into a political change. So we just protest. That's great, but I think the idea is that, I don't think that there's a clear causal link that from the protest, the government is going to, government is not afraid of students, and government has international support and Russian support and Trump support, and so what do they care? But they have been very long, very sustained, and people are more optimistic politically in Serbia than they have been for a very long time because there's this vibrancy of activism that they've not seen.
Okay. Thank you, Jelena. Thank you for making this event a success. I just want to call you all